Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. So I'm just going to say up front that this was a special episode for me. Usually in these introductions, I like to weave some sort of narrative together that's connecting my guest to larger questions that I've been thinking about, making the case for this conversation. But with my guest today, I found that was actually really hard to do because his work has been so present in my work life for decades now that it was hard to pull the threads apart about how he's influenced me. So I'm excited that for the last episode of our spring season, I'm joined today by Hans Ulrich Obrist. Hans likely needs no introduction. He's a curator, he's a writer, an editor, an art historian. He's, as he's defined himself often, a junction maker. He's looking for connections between people, between artists, between objects, between publics, between ideas. He's currently the artistic director of the Serpentine Gallery in London, where he's served since 2006. And perhaps most notably there, he's helped organize the famous Serpentine Pavilion, where every year a different emerging architect designs a new pavilion that is open for everyone. Hans has interviewed artists, designers, architects, and thinkers for his interview project and has authored or edited dozens of books, including a series of books on the art of curating, books like Ways of Curating and A Brief History of Curating, which are two books that I've found myself returning to often. For years, I've been inspired by his vast output. I've appreciated how he sought to demystify curatorial practice, how he's championed artists, and how he's brought together various fields from art to architecture to music to literature. When I started this show, in fact, almost 10 years ago, I had never interviewed anybody before, and I turned to his range of published conversations to see how he structured an interview and how he asked questions. At the risk of pretension or hyperbole, I've thought what I'm doing here is hopefully a small design-centric version of his interview project. So that is where we begin this conversation. We talk about conversations. We talk about why interviews and dialogue are so central to his practice. And we talk about this idea of curation as a type of junction making, how his first job, where his title was migratory curator, what did that mean for him and how did that shape the work he would do since? We talk about the overlap of editing and curation, the difference between making exhibitions and making books, and we talk about the process to stage the pavilion every year. This was a fun conversation and a real honor for me to have Hans on the program to close out our spring season of episodes. We'll be back with new episodes in the fall, and we'll release a series of some of our greatest hits over the next couple months. Until then, if you like the show and what we do here, you can support our work by joining our Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that is free for all, as well as a paid tier that gets you a bonus interview each month and helps keep this show free for everyone all the time. Our paying subscribers truly enable us to do this work and keep the show going. So if you want more of this in the world, please consider signing up and supporting our work. Thank you, as always, for listening. And here is my conversation with Hans Ulrich Obrist. I would like to start this conversation with something that I think we have in common, core to your work and core to my work, obviously, is this idea of the conversation, of the interview. And in your book, Ways of Curating, you wrote, "The more conversations I recorded and filmed, the more important they became to my curatorial practice." Can you tell me about how you approach conversations and the role that conversations and interviews play in your larger body of work? How do you see dialogue as being central to what you do as a curator?
Yeah, thank you for this great question. It's a pleasure to be in your wonderful podcast, to be part of that. I suppose that I've always thought my work or my life is a kind of an infinite conversation, and it began quite early on when I, as a teenager, started to meet artists, and And obviously, out of these conversations, started to develop my first exhibitions, such as the kitchen show and
Hmm.
lots of other, different shows in unusual locations. And because I was so young, I was in my sort of teen, like 17, 16, 17, 18 years old when I began with my studio visits. The artists somehow were all wondering what am I going to do because, I had no idea. I just knew
Right.
that I wanted to work with art. I was very passionate about art, about what kind of impact art could have on society, how we could sort of bring artists also, in more central in society. I was kind of interested in this idea of connecting art to other disciplines. I very early on found this book by Alexander Dorner,
Mm.
which is about ways of basically thinking about, I mean, to kind of cut the long story short, Dorner said, if you want to understand the forces effective in visual art, we need to connect to science, to music, to literature. And he did that, of course, with his amazing museum in Hanover, in the sort of 20s,
Hmm.
30s. And then later on, when he was in the United States, he sort of reflected on it also theoretically in his writings. Was very inspired by John Dewey. And I found that book as a teenager in Switzerland was very inspiring to me. So I kind of early on knew that I somehow wanted to maybe work with exhibitions and museums. And then I would say Vasari was also important because, in a way, Vasari's lives of the artist and lives of the architect were really an amazing gift, no? Because, of course, the first one I read was the one on Leonardo, no? Which, of course, was, yeah, I mean, in a way, a very seminal account of cultural activities, and it was for me very much in a way the idea that maybe there would be historic figures about among our contemporaries. There would be maybe uh, ama- amazing artists in our time, and that I could maybe meet them and I could maybe
Hmm.
work with them, and that really was what this book of Vasari, I would say, triggered or unleashed or somehow, no? And then based on that, I started to make studio visits, and then as I mentioned, in a way, the artists sort of started to kind of give me tasks because I was so, you know, basically in such an early stage of my trajectory that they felt they had to give me some mentorship or maybe give me ideas.
Right.
So each of these artists gave me some form of ideas, and certainly one of the most important ones was the one by Alighiero Boetti, the Italian artist who said, you should basically map and make a cartography of unrealized artist projects, and then maybe enable the artists to do them, maybe help artists to do projects which don't fit into a box. Also, my talker said, it's wonderful that you visit. I mean, she was in her early 30s when I visited her, and I was 17. And she said, it's wonderful that you visit young artists like me, but you should also look at pioneers, because there is a lot of amnesia. You should look at artists who are
Mm.
forgotten, particularly so many female artists who haven't had the visibility they deserve. You should basically make that a very important part of your research. And so I just basically just took all of these on board. And at a certain moment, I realized that many of these conversations, um, I would remember them, but maybe not all the details. And that's really
Right.
when I then started to think maybe I should record them. But I was also a little bit shy to sort of record these studio visits. And who then really took this inhibition away was my friend Jonas Mekas, the legendary
Mm-hmm.
filmmaker, because he basically says you're one day going to regret it if you don't record these conversations, and you should basically you should just do it, and ideally you should film them. And I mean, if today I have this archive of almost 4,000 hours of of recordings, of which probably about 1,500 are 2,000 are filmed, it's really thanks to Jonas, because I don't know if I would ever have dared to do that. And then I went to Chicago, and I went to talk to Stats Terkel because I started to get interested in this idea of oral history, and spoke to Stats Terkel, and that was another, very important
Mm-hmm.
conversation. So I had lots of different mentors in this project, and I would say along the way, besides Vasari, there was also, and this book by Alexander Dorner, there was also, because of course, Vasari also brought together the disciplines, architecture, painting, sculpture. It was sort of, I mean, it was not only the lives of the artists, it was the lives of the artists and the lives of the architects. He he brought
Right.
together. And I would say that then, Donna said that as well. And then I came across the conversations of Francis Bacon and David
Mm.
Sylvester. And that sort of taught me that it's important to talk to artists again and again, because there's so many layers, to someone's life and someone's work, that one conversations cannot cover it. And I loved how David Sylvester would more and more approach the work of Bacon through these many different conversations.
You set up a couple things that I want to talk to you about, and I want to come back to this idea of junction making and connections between disciplines. But I'm struck by the amount of conversations that you've now recorded, and you mentioned you started basically when you were a kid, when you were a teenager. Has your approach to the conversation changed over the years? Now that you're not a teenager, now that you are somebody in the art world, now that you're somebody who is known, has that changed how you engage with artists or the types of conversations that you want to have with artists?
Yes, I think in a way I'm still maybe a teenager, because I think the conversation, uh, whenever I basically prepare a conversation, when I go to a studio, and at a certain moment I also started to extend my research from art into
Hmm.
architecture,
Hmm.
because we built these pavilions and commissioned these pavilions every summer at the Serpentine. So, and I was also one of the reasons why I joined the Serpentine in 2006 when Julia Pickton-Johns invited me. I was just so excited that besides, because with art, you make exhibitions to produce reality and or public art or different projects. But with architecture, it's not really possible to exhibit it somehow through maquettes. One has to build it. And it's
Hmm.
quite difficult to find opportunities to build. I mean, sometimes as a museum director, you maybe have an opportunity to build a new wing, or once in a lifetime to build a new museum, but that's very rare. But this idea to basically be a client of architecture and make research and commission an
Right.
architect every year seemed just to be so incredibly, exciting. And then, I would, of course, particularly when I visit people outside my comfort zone or also outside my own field. Initially, I mean, now I'm very familiar with architecture, but initially I wasn't. Then I did the same to music. I did the same to
Hmm.
fashion. I did the same to science, literature, poetry. And obviously, I have to each time become a student again and read everything this artist has, or this writer, or this poet, or this scientist has written. It's like preparing for school. So in that sense,
Right.
it's sort of maybe a lot. In that sense, that never changed. What certainly did change is that I started to prepare these conversations more. I mean, at the
Yeah.
beginning, it was sort of fully, improvised. There is still a lot of improv
Yeah.
involved, but I started, once I started to also record them, and that's a whole other story why they then got published. Because for the first sort of 10 years, I never thought about publishing them. It was just a research tool. And then in 2003, we did the Venice Biennale. We did Utopia Station with Rick Tiravanit and also with Molly Nesbitt, a project about utopia, a station for
Hmm.
utopia with Edouard Glissant and Yoko Ono and many different artists and poets and philosophers. And on the occasion of that, a book was published, a 1,000 pages book, was an idea of Francesco Bonami, and it was published by PT Imagine. And this book was sort of included 60, 70 of my conversations. And so then I always thought like, wow, it's actually getting published.
Right.
And then I started to think, differently and started to really prepare them. But then I sort of thought it would be sort of a pity if that sort of very free flowing, also non-linearity would be lost, sort of that there isn't a linear script. And then I came up with this sort of almost sort of George Brecht, maybe John Cage, but also George Brecht in kind of Alison Knowles inspired sort of score system where I have these cards, like the Fluxus cards.
Ah.
And then I would sort of basically have these cards or these pieces of paper on which I have notes and ideas and basically and then I would sort of basically order them in a specific order I think the conversation could go, but then the conversation usually never goes in that direction, and then I can basically just move the cards around and change. So I'm not bound
Yeah.
to a linear script in a way. So that's kind of how it evolved.
I love that. I very much relate to that. I also started when I started this, did not do any prep, sort of just went in having a conversation, and sort of now the most work on this podcast is the preparation. Is that preparing, and just like you, and this is a little like, behind the scenes, I guess, have a set of questions and ideas that I'm moving around as we're talking. So it's really nice to hear that similarity. I want to go back to this idea of blending cultures or making connections. You've referred to curation as junction making. You've called it map making. You've called it pollinating different cultures. I'm wondering kind of how you think about your position in that junction making, in that map making. You're both you're an independent person, but you're also representing the artist. Sometimes you're playing the role of the spectator or the viewer, translating artist work to some larger kind of collection or group show. You're acting as sounding board and critic. You're having these conversations. What is your role specifically, or how do you think about your role in that act of junction making, or the perspective that you bring to that exchange?
Yeah, I mean, I think basically the point of departure is, of course, this idea of enabling, junctions. I mean, when I wake up in
Mm,
the morning every day, I always make a cyber introduction or a WhatsApp introduction or an introduction, by text or via Instagram. I mean, basically, it's possible to do it on or Signal, and do it through all
yeah.
the different sort of platforms according to what my friends would use. But I kind of basically always bring two people together who haven't met before. That's the beginning of my day. So I
Mm,
think, in a way, this idea of the junction making, because as a curator, I make, of course, junctions between artworks, so it's junctions between objects.
right.
But then at the same time, um, Lucy Lippard, another big inspiration for me, she inspired me to work, with instructions and recipes and how to manuals and do projects like Do It.
Right.
When and also her whole environmental work is so important. One of the most important really curatorial inspirations, I would say. And Lucy Lippard wrote early on this book about the dematerialization of art. So it's not only objects, it's also with conceptual art, it's non-objects. Then Michel Serres talks about the quasi-object. The quasi-object would be a football would be a
Mm,
quasi-object, because it sort of basically produces meaning once we engage with it. And then, of course, Timothy Morton talks about the hyper
right.
objects. That would be the fog or the weather system or,
Right.
bigger systems in that sense. And so I think I make junctions between objects, non-objects, quasi-objects, hyper objects. Roger Penrose, whom I visited this weekend, the 94-year-old extraordinary scientist in the UK, he taught me this weekend about impossible objects.
Mm,
Like in
I don't
Escher's
know that one.
drawings. Like it's like
Oh,
in Escher's drawings.
oh yeah,
You
yeah.
in 2D you have basically objects which can't exist in 3D. So now we can add impossible objects. So I make junctions between objects, non-objects, quasi-objects, hyper-objects, and as of this Sunday, also impossible objects.
Impossible.
But then, of course, foremost, I make junctions between people also.
Right.
I bring people together through the marathons, through the programs I organize, through the sort of formats of public gatherings, but also through the exhibitions or the Serpentine Pavilions, which have free admissions, have no doors. People just meet. I mean, in Lina Gottmes' pavilion 2 years ago, she said at table, she created in the pavilion this big table where people, strangers who had never met, they could meet each other. So I make junctions between people foremost as well.
Right.
So yes, and I would say, where am I in this junction making? I'm often trying to be the enabler, the
Mm,
catalyst, who then at a certain moment has to disappear because the catalyst can't stay in the way. So in that sense, it's often to be in the middle of things, but in the center of nothing, something like that.
yeah, yeah, I like that. One of the first jobs that you had, this role was created for you. It was called the migratory curator, which seems like it
Yeah.
speaks to this. And when I first heard that, I thought it meant like you're out looking for other things. But you've described this as also migratory within the museum, connecting people within the museum. How did that job influence all of this that you're talking about now? How did that influence your role as junction maker or enabler or kind of connector?
Yeah, after initially meeting, and I think mentors are so important. Yeah, for me, I mean, university was important because I studied in St. Gallen economy and ecology with Professor Binswang, and I was,
Hmm.
it was very important for me. But even more important were the mentors. And first of all, I met mostly artists, and the artists were my mentors. They gave me tasks. They taught me. and they taught me also to look and look and look again, because obviously I saw a lot. I mean, it was kind of like, in a way, I was inspired by, because my parents never went to museums, but they took me
Right.
to a monastic library, or the
Right.
monastery library in St. Gallen. And in this library, I was very fascinated by the monks who would sort of, learn everything in the monastery and then bring that knowledge to other places. And so I went to cities. I visited lots of artists, studios, made research, and I brought this knowledge. I went by night train to the next city and brought this knowledge. And that was in the 80s. There was no internet. It was kind
Right.
of the internet before the internet. I tried. So that was another form of making junctions. It's just by carrying these ideas and in a way, bringing these ideas in a way, from city to city. And I traveled a lot by night train and was in that sense really on the move. And Suzanne Paget became my mentor as a museum director, because that's when I was in
Mm.
my early 20s. I wanted to learn how to run a museum, how to kind of make exhibitions on a more practical level. And she is the most visionary museum director of her generation in Europe. She did the most amazing historic show, the most amazing contemporary show, came initially from poetry. He's one of these very, very few people who really can do trans-historical exhibitions in such an amazing way. And uh, and she was interested in this research I did, and said, but if she hires me for the museum, then it would somehow slow down that research, or would make it maybe impossible for me to continue. So she wanted to enable me to continue to do that
Mm.
research, but yet me have a continuation of that work. So she created this job, the migratory curator. I had a tiny little office, and she wanted me to do museum, exhibitions in unexpected locations in the museum. So, for
Ah.
example, we would do an exhibition of Douglas Garden. It was one of his first museum shows in the telephone system. So he would, in the telephone system, when you called the museum, a voice would say, from the moment you hear these words until you meet somebody with blue eyes or brown eyes,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you would meet that sentence also as a text piece in the collection, and
Mm.
you would encounter it as a graffiti, also in an unexpected place. Then we had Felix Gonzalez Torres, another amazing artist
Yeah.
who basically went to find vases, and then we went together to the florist and to the market to find flowers, and he would basically arrange a flower bouquet for every office in the museum. So because he said, the mood, the institution would change if everybody would work with flowers on their desk, and then encourage people to find flowers, and that
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
continue. And then he would install a billboard at the entrance of the museum. Then Kouchonga would create little mini architectures out of sugar cubes and stamp parts of the museum, but almost invisibly. But on your trajectory to the museum, you would meet these little structures, and you
Yeah.
suddenly would see stamps. Or we also did the first museum show of Sarah Say,
Mm.
and Sarah Say created her fragile, amazing little architectures as well on the stairways, so you could either see them or miss them. Or Rick Tiramanid would do a station to make tea or coffee. And nobody realized that that was an exhibition. It's only when we removed it, we got lots of letters from people who said, what a pity that that great initiative was removed. So that was Migrateur.
Yeah. I have a I love that. And it's making me think about something that I want to try to form into a question, because even in this conversation, you're jumping between talking about artists, poets, architects. Your work spans these disciplines. You've done shows about music, about film, and this is part of that junction making. This is part of that migration that you're talking about. And this is making me think about two things. I'm curious if you have to kind of approach your role differently when you're moving between these spaces, when you are talking to poets versus when you're talking to artists versus when you're talking to architects. Do you have to bring something different? And then the second part of my question is, does that even matter anymore? Because we're sort of in this moment where all of these things are blending together anyway. Everybody's kind of a multi hyphenate. Does that actually change what it means to be a junction maker when so many people are just making junctions within their own body of work? Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think yes, in a way. I mean, obviously, I have a basically a home base, a place where I come from and where I always return, and that is the art world, and I clearly,
Mm,
my activities have always started in the art world, and I bring in a lot of different practitioners from other fields into the art world, and I'm then also invited often to to curate outside the art world.
oh,
But I
that's
always have
interesting.
come from a place where basically and I do think that and that's of course the home base is also exhibitions, and I've always believed in that idea that exhibitions are an amazing possibility to bring things together. I mean, we live in a world which is increasingly divided, and I think it's important to that's another way of junction making, that we bring worlds together,
Yeah.
which otherwise don't talk to each other. And I believe that museums and exhibitions are an amazing possibility to do so, because the format also allows it. I will give you an example. So when I always wanted to meet Agnes Varda, the French filmmaker,
Yeah.
and was introduced to her by artist friends, by Christian Boltanski and Annette Messager, maybe 2002 or three, when we did Utopia Station. So we invited her to our Utopia Station, to the Art Biennale, and she had been invited to the Film Mostra and to all the film festivals. Cannes, I mean, she later on won an Oscar.
Hmm.
She won literally every award you can win in the film world. And she felt very limited by that, because she says, I can only show a feature film or a short film, which enters these competitions and these categories,
Oh, I
but I might
see.
want to do other things. So when we invited her to the Art Biennial, she felt liberated. She came disguised as a potato, with a potato costume, with a sound coming out of this potato costume. And she did an amazing installation for us with tons of potatoes, which started to grow,
Yeah.
almost like a farming situation, and then with a multi-screen projection. So it became this very multi-sensory environment, so different from what she could do in a cinema. And she told me the day of the opening, that we liberated her from
Mm,
that. She could suddenly do something she could never do. And I think that that's, in a way, what is very exciting about this idea of exhibitions. But it's not only that we can bring different disciplines together, we can also create these dialogues, with different audiences, with different publics, because I think it's about bridge building, and they who would never encounter each other. To give you an example, we work a lot with video games. I started to kind
yeah.
of wanted to bring together the world of art and video games. So at the Serpentine, 2 years ago, we did this project with Fortnite, the Cute, and the Serpentine with cars, and the Serpentine was replicated on the landing page of Fortnite. So we had 152 million visitors. We had 152 million visitors in basically in 2 weeks online. That
Right.
was the most visited contemporary art exhibitions ever. But then all of a sudden, because the show in the gallery lasted longer, we only had the landing page for 2 weeks. But then all of a sudden, we had thousands and thousands of teenagers who brought their parents to the physical gallery, gamers who had never been. And that is something which, for example, this summer I'm working on a show for the Manchester International Festival, which I curate with Juan Mata and Josh Wildig. And so it's the first time I co-curate an exhibition with a football player, and we create teams of football players and artists, always collaborative teams. So, and that again, we bring people together who otherwise would never meet. But that's also what happens in the pavilions of the Serpentine every summer, because the pavilions are in the park, and as they have no doors, people just walk in and have an
Right.
encounter each other, etc., etc. So this idea of junction making is also about bringing people together, from so many different walks of life who otherwise just would never meet, and also many people who would never go to an exhibition. That I see that as a mission also.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think thinking about the art world as your home base is actually really interesting. It's a way, like you said, it's a way for you to both bring people into that, like Agnes
Yeah.
Varda, but it's also a way to then give that back out to people who otherwise wouldn't be in that world. So you're welcoming people in, and you're also kind of going out and evangelizing in some way. And I think you're right. The exhibition is a great way to do that. And you've done that many times. You've also done that with books many times. And as I was preparing for this conversation, I was kind of surprised by how many books you've published and edited also, because I just think of you as a curator. Does thinking about books, is that a form of curation for you? Is the book a form of exhibition making for you? Do you approach that differently when you're thinking about it in a space versus something printed and distributed?
Yeah, definitely. It's another way of basically making exhibitions. Yeah, printed matter. To give you an example, a concrete example. About 20 years ago, we started this magazine called Point d'Ironie because in the old Larousse, there is an inverted question mark. So basically, that was basically in the
Yeah.
old Larousse, the sign for irony. So
Ah.
we wanted to reactivate this point of irony, and we did a magazine with Agnes B, the artist and fashion designer and philanthropist, and also the artist Christian Boltanski, where over the last 20 years, we've invited a couple of times a year an artist to do two-folded posters. So they're quite big posters. When you fold them, it
Oh,
becomes an 8-page magazine.
yeah.
And we print, approximately 100,000 copies each time. And they're distributed for free in many different places all over the world. And that's a print exhibition, and you find these
Yeah.
posters in all kinds of contexts. So I've done a lot of exhibitions with posters, with postcards, this idea of dissemination, and that we create sort of situations where people can experience art where they expect it least. And also, I think it has to do also with my childhood in Switzerland, because my parents, with the exception of the monastery library, they never took me to a museum. So how did art come to me? Art came to me through such forms of dissemination where very unexpected. I would not have come into the art, into the contact zone with art otherwise. So, for example, my parents would always go to Zurich once a month, from the village, and then on the main road there was this older kind of florist who sold flowers. He came from a farm, but he would also sell his drawings. He became quite famous later on as an outsider artist. He would mostly draw cows because he was fascinated by the cows going to the mountains in summer and coming down to the valley in winter. It's almost like
Okay.
a procession. So he made these cow machines and amazing drawings. And he would sell, my parents would sometimes buy flowers, and then one could sort of for $5 or something, one could buy for 5 Swiss francs, one could buy a drawing. He would sort of, so
Uh,
that was an encounter with art. At the same time, in the streets, there were these graffitis because Zurich had Harald Nägeli in the 80s. He is a very legendary artist. He's still alive and works today. Harald Nägeli is famous as the sprayer of Zurich. He was a friend of Joseph
mm,
Beuys. And, I saw these figures, these sprayed figures in the streets. And I asked my parents, what is this? I got super fascinated by it. And then, it came through the Montreux Jazz Festival, some Keith Haring posters and dangly on the chocolate. Then basically another example for that would basically be Emma Kunz. There's this amazing Swiss healer, Emma Kunz. She basically discovered the healing qualities of a quarry, of the stones from a quarry, and created a
mm,
powder. And my mother would buy this powder, and it was one of her spiritual drawings was on the cover, and I kept looking at that and wanted to know more. And then, we talk about the 80s, so the timetable of the train wasn't online. It was basically a analog timetable from the train
right.
arrived in our
Right.
home every year, and the Swiss Railway would commission an artist every year to do the cover of this timetable. And it was the Swiss artist Claude Sander who did it, I think in 1984, 85, and I was 16, 17. And I was so fascinated that I looked at it every day, and then I told my parents I have to meet this artist, and that became my first studio visit. You see, so I kind of based on that because that's how I
Yeah.
came to art. I always wanted to provide that possibility for kids who grow up now. So I want my exhibitions to go to the people.
I mean, thinking about that and thinking about this idea of distribution and of printed matter, uh, this might be a reductive question, but do you see a difference between editing and curating?
Yeah, the transitions, I would say, are very fluid. But I think at the same time, it's interesting, if you look at the point d'ironie, um, today I was just looking at, at some of kind of my older books because we were sort of putting them on a shelf. And so then I was like thinking, there are, of course, certain of the publications I've edited, which are catalogs, they are about an artist's work. I've written about an
Right.
artist's work, I've done an
Right.
interview, and then it's illustrated with images. And then some other publications are exhibitions because they are done by artists. So I would say that's,
Oh, that's
they're done by
interesting.
artists. So in that sense, the point d'ironie is basically it's a carte blanche to an artist. They do the layout, they do an artwork for that space. So it's in that sense space. It's not about the artist. So I would say that's maybe a difference.
You mentioned earlier that you think of the art world as your home base, and everything that you do is coming out of that world, and you're bringing people into that world. And I'm thinking about this idea of migration and you kind of being all around the world, talking to artists everywhere. But you also have a physical home base. You're also in London. You're also at the Serpentine. And I'm wondering how being there, you've been in this position since 2006, being rooted in a place like that, how does that influence your work? How does that, having a physical space, having the pavilion, having London as a home base, how does that influence when you're traveling and when you're talking to artists elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I basically would say that in the 90s, I was mostly, a migratory curator. And then already in the early 2000s, I kind of worked out of the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris in a much more continuous way. But still as a curator, and I wanted to kind of do not only group shows or biennials, but I wanted to work more into depth with artists on solo exhibitions, for which one does have to work in a museum in order to do them. And so that was basically the first chapter in that. But then, obviously in 2006, I became initially co-director and then artistic director of the Serpentine. And that basically means that it sort of became possible also to think about the structure of an institution, about
Mm,
about thinking, because I think in a way, I've been thinking a lot about exhibitions and an expanded notion of exhibitions, and new formats of exhibitions. I've been thinking, I mean, it's been very inspired by Edouard Glissant. He was,
mhm.
my biggest, I would say, in terms of ideas, and continues to be my biggest inspiration. And we also were very close friends, and I traveled with him, and we did many books and conversations together. And I kind of learned from Edouard Glissant that we live in an age of globalization, that the homogenized forces of globalization are a risk, and that we need to resist them. That lots of things disappear through that. Cultural phenomena disappear. I mean, my sort of whole, I started on social media a movement to celebrate handwriting,
Right,
to
right.
kind of because handwriting might be less present and disappear, but also languages disappear. So Glissant basically always told me we need to resist these homogenizing forces of globalization, but he also early on understood that there will be counter reactions to globalization, such as new nationalisms, new localisms, new lack of tolerance, something we can see now all over the world. And he said we need to resist that as well. And that's why he talked about mondialité. How can we be local without being localists? How can we actually be both local but also enable a global exchange and the global dialogue? And I started to think all the time about how I can do this with exhibitions. And initially,
Yeah.
that was, of course, with a project like Do It, which has now happened in 169 cities, and it never stopped touring since I started it 31 years ago. The project Do It is basically permanently learning from the local context, growing. There are no transports involved. It's probably one of the most sustainable shows because we just send instructions and recipes, add local instructions, and then mix them, and
Right.
then they're being interpreted. And that's totally based on Glissant, that project we started with Boltanski and Lavier. But then after having done this with exhibitions, I wanted to kind of think, what does it mean, an art institution in the 21st century, and that it maybe also needs new departments. It maybe needs, new, one has to
Mm,
maybe needs to change the structure. And that's when I started to think, it could be really interesting. And when I was invited in 2006 to join the Serpentine, it was certainly because of architecture. I was very excited about that. But I was also excited to start to structurally think more. And of course, I continue to always live between geographies. The trains continue to be
right.
important. Between the UK and France and Switzerland. But indeed, I started to think about I started to think about one structure in terms of also new departments, and that's when we began. With the new experiments in art and technology, the idea of
Hmm.
having a technology department where today we can, produce video games. We just had a whole year with AI with Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst
Yeah.
and also with Refik Anadol. We did a garden with AI with Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg, where Alexandra created a pollinator garden with the help of AI in Kensington Garden, a very big
Right.
public artwork, initially not conceived for humans, but for pollinator. And that's of course only possible because we have this department with technology with now 5 curators. And at the same time, and that began really 12 years ago with Ben Vickers, a conversation I had with Ben Vickers, who challenged us and said basically, an institution should not just have a website. We should sort of think more
Right.
about what we could do with technology. The same is true for ecology. Out of the conversations with Gustav Metzger grew this idea to do a department to basically do a sustained activity with ecology, where we have campaigns with artists, where we have long-term ongoing projects with artists, and at least one exhibition a year, which really, now we're installing Giuseppe Pennone, which is all about being in communion with the environment. The exhibition will happen in
Right.
the park outside with his trees, and will happen inside where he's bringing many leaves. So he's creating a garden inside the gallery. And then, of course, also with Civic, where we basically think about how, what we discussed before, how can art go into society? And we're just opening it's touring to the Triennale in Milano in April, our Radio Ballad project, where we had 4 artists for several years, in residence in Barking Dagenham, in the borough of Barking Dagenham. And the artists worked with care workers, with social workers, developed films. And that, of course, also means longue durée. It also means to go beyond event culture and think about longer,
Right.
time horizons. And I think we always need to listen to artists. And at the moment, so many artists are more interested in doing a farm or in doing a long durational project,
Yeah.
physical or with technology, than to stay in that time framework of events. And what does it mean for an institution to do, so then we sometimes have to, as with Alexander Ginsberg, have to do a garden rather than an exhibition.
I want to try to connect that to the pavilion a little bit and just hear you talk a little bit more about the pavilion, because it's actually interesting in the context of this conversation how so many of the ideas that guide your work, going all the way back to being a kid and kind of seeing this art come to you without you having to seek it out, seem like they manifest themselves in the pavilion, which is something that's on the museum but is open to the public. It is both kind of global and local. It's rooted in London, but you get people who had never built in London before. And the other piece is that you're sort of finding young emerging architects to build this too. And then it's also durational, but it's also an event at the same time. Can you talk to me a little bit about the process of the pavilion? How are you finding the next people to select? How are you selecting the next people to build? What is that platform like? What is the call? What is the ask to them like? Can you just talk to me a little bit about kind of the inner workings of the pavilion?
Yeah, thank you for this question, because it's a kind of a long story, because
Okay, sorry.
I'm very happy to tell you, because it started in 2000, and it's all about change and evolution, and at the same time continuation, because it started in 2000 with Julia Peyton-Johns,
Right.
when she invited Zaha Hadid to do the first pavilion. And the idea was, the UK has extraordinary architects. The UK has also got London has such a international, art world and many different worlds, music world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But for whatever reasons, it was quite closed for international architects to work here. Most of the really well-known 20th century architects from abroad did not build in
Right.
the UK. So the idea was to basically get these architects to build and create a more polyphonic situation of more voices. And that's why the rule of the game was established, that it's always the first structure of an architect built in this country. And I joined in 2006. So Rem Koolhaas and Cecil Balmond was the first one I co-commissioned. And we continued this series basically until 2012, involving Peter Zumthor, or Herzog Toblerone with Ai Weiwei,
Mm-hmm.
or Jean Nouvel, or Frank Gehry, or Katsuo Sejima with Ryu Nishizawa, and so on. So it was basically a introduction of these extremely well-known architects to this country, and that of course made the scheme very well known.
Right.
And we felt sort of around 2012 that it would be really now the moment to maybe let it evolve into a new chapter and work with younger architects, because it would then not only be the first structure these young architects would build in this country, but it would actually also maybe be the first structure they build outside their own country,
Right.
uh, and also have a very significant impact maybe on their trajectory, and be useful. I
Yeah.
always think, we have to think about what is useful. I always want to do things which are useful for art, useful for architecture, useful for design, useful for the world, useful for the visitors. And so we felt this could be a useful next step. And we also felt that all of a sudden, a new generation of architects, very exciting architects, had started to basically come to our attention. So we intensified that research. Sue Fujimoto was the first younger architect we invited, and the project has evolved in that direction ever since. More recently, with architects like Frida Escobedo
Yep.
or Lina Gottme or Sumaya Wali, or also Min Suk Chu last year, and this year it will be Marina Tabassum from Bangladesh. We felt it would be interesting also to address the fact that, address the importance also of making the architecture more inclusive, more polyphonic, look at many different geographies, and of course also really emphasize the presence of female architects in that program, because that seems important for the architecture world and for the world in general, that happens now. And it's of course very exciting that soon after, Frida Escobedo built the pavilion she had rarely built outside Mexico. She won the commission to do the Metropolitan Museum. At the same time, Lina Gottme was just announced to be the winner of the British Museum. Liu Jia Kun, who designed our first ever only Chinese pavilion, just won the Pritzker Prize. Sumaya Wali has basically won a commission to build a bridge in Belgium. So I think in a way, it's very exciting, that our scheme can be used for. Francis Queré won the Pritzker Prize also soon after doing the Serpentine Pavilion. And I think interesting is also that sometimes, I mean, this is resolutely an architecture scheme, because we want this to sort of also produce meaning in the architecture context, it not being an art project. We do
Yeah.
a lot of art projects, but this is an architecture project. But we do sometimes work with artists who actually are architects. We have Olafur Eliasson, he works with Snoheta, who is basically having an architecture office and
Yeah.
designs buildings. We have
Theaster
Theaster
Gates.
Gates,
Yep.
the Black Chapel. That's basically, Theaster has a background, but very few people know that he was, has a background before he was an artist as an urban planner.
Right.
And we thought it was always obvious that Theaster would go into architecture. And the same thing is of true also for Ai Weiwei, who has built many buildings in China as an architect, including the Olympic Stadium, with Herzog de Meuron.
This is actually a really nice way to ask you my final question, because I really like how you're talking about how the pavilion has shifted from being established architect to these emerging
Yeah.
architects, that it can change the trajectory of their careers. And I was going to say you have a great track record there of previous pavilion commissions who have gone on to do great things. I read that a question that you always ask artists when you do interviews is, what is advice you would give to a young artist? And you are very generous in crediting your mentors, of crediting the people that came before you in how they shaped you. Now you're working with a lot of people who are sometimes younger than you. You're working with people at the start of their career. What have you learned from the artists and the architects who are just coming up, the mentors who are younger than you, let's say? How have they changed how you work, or how have they influenced how you think about what you do?
Yeah, that's also super fascinating, because I think over the last couple of years, what we can see with architecture is that, for many of these architects, it's really, very important to focus on also a social dimension of architecture, the environmental dimension. I think is very important. But we are particularly excited, this year with Marina Tabassum,
Mm-hmm.
who is going to design the structure this year. And that's a case in point, because she basically creates this capsule in time, which is going to be the first pavilion actually, which is going to move horizontally. So
Oh, wow.
it's going to change and move. And if you look at her practice, there is an amazing social, political, and also ecological engagement, but also a really strong focus on the work in her own context. She has really
Mm.
worked in Dhaka and wanted to work with her own community, has worked also in relation to the climate emergency there, because obviously the flooding in Bangladesh is extreme and it's a very vulnerable country for climate change, and the impacts of climate change are felt very directly. So she focused really on architecture's role in addressing living conditions, for marginalized individuals in her own region, uplift the environmental and living conditions, as she told me in a conversation we had last week. And one of her most celebrated projects is, of course, her Kudibari small house project, where she created these modular structures, which were developed in 2020 onwards for those living on the sandbeds of the rivers, Jamuna, Meghna, and Tisa, which basically are, near the delta. So these are basically permanently changing conditions. And so these structures have an ability to be easily disassembled and moved when necessary because of floodings, and other conditions. So I think, we, of course, but then I think what is also so fascinating, and that's completely independent of the generation, that can happen with a very young
Right.
artist or architect, but it can also happen, with an architect or an artist in the 80s or 90s. It's just that, very often they change what we expect from them. The idea that art changes or architecture can change what we expect from it. And that the famous thing when Diaghilev and Cocteau had an exchange, the étonnez-moi, that there is very often, a surprise involved. And that is something which, is one of the many reasons why I get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, you write in your book, Ways of Curating, that the best definition of art is that which expands the definition, which is sort of exactly what you're talking about right now. And I think is what you're doing in a lot of your work, actually, is expanding these definitions and breaking these boundaries between them. As I said at the beginning, your work and especially your interviews and conversations were very influential to me and why I do this project. And so it was really an honor to have you on the show and to talk to you about how you think about all of this work. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you for your great questions, and it's a great honor for me to be part of your podcast.
That was my conversation with Hans Ulrich Obrist. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is funded thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. We will be back with new episodes in September. Thank you for listening.